Life Stories brings you tales of courage, resilience, and transformation that inspire and resonate deeply. Today's story takes us to Cedar Ridge, a town where injustice and silence once thrived. When a new police chief faced public humiliation at the hands of his own officers, he didn't just endure, he ignited a movement. Join us as we uncover how one man's quiet strength and determination brought an entire community together to rebuild trust, restore dignity, and create lasting change. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories for more incredible journeys. Let's begin today's story. Cedar Ridge was the kind of town you'd drive through without giving much thought. Tucked away in South Carolina, its main street was lined with faded storefronts and a diner whose sign had seen better days. The kind of place that seemed untouched by time. But beneath the veneer of simplicity lay a community grappling with unspoken tensions, where tradition and prejudice often walked hand in hand. Michael Adams knew exactly what he was stepping into when he agreed to take the role of police chief. A black man in a position of authority in Cedar Ridge wasn't going to be welcomed with open arms. And he had no illusions about that. He wasn't here to make friends, he was here to make a difference. The call had come just a month earlier, the voice on the other end serious and measured. "Michael," it began, "I have an offer for you. But it won't be easy. Cedar Ridge has its challenges. They've had issues. And frankly, I'm not sure they're ready for someone like you." Michael had stared out his window, weighing the words carefully. He understood the unspoken message. Someone like you. It wasn't the first time he'd heard it. And it wouldn't be the last. But he didn't hesitate. "That's exactly why I need to do it," he replied. And so, he found himself here, driving into town with a quiet determination. His car rolled past the weathered welcome sign, and he could feel the weight of eyes following him as he drove down Main Street. People paused mid-conversation, their gazes fixed on him, some curious, others wary. Michael had grown used to these looks. They no longer fazed him. He pulled into the parking lot of the Fairview Diner, a modest spot at the center of town. The smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon drifted into the air as he stepped out of the car, his leather jacket a quiet barrier against the morning chill. On the porch sat a group of older men, their chatter dying down as they noticed him. One of them adjusted his hat, his gaze lingering just a little too long. Michael pushed open the diner door, the sharp jingle of the bell announcing his arrival. The conversations inside hushed, heads turning to take him in. He wasn't surprised by the reaction. In places like Cedar Ridge, new faces were scrutinized. And Michael's presence was more than just new, it was a statement. He walked to the counter, taking a seat on one of the worn stools. The young waitress behind the counter hesitated before approaching, her nervous smile betraying her unease. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious. "Black coffee," Michael said evenly. She nodded, turning to grab a mug, her movements hurried and a little shaky. As she poured, he glanced around the room. The walls were lined with old photos of the town, parades from the 1950s, a schoolhouse, and the church steeple that still stood on the hill. It all spoke of a town rooted in its past, reluctant to change. Near the window sat two men in uniform, their laughter carrying above the hushed conversations. One was lean and wiry, with sandy hair and a cocky smirk. The other was larger, with a shaved head and a demeanor that screamed intimidation. Michael didn't need introductions to know their kind. They radiated authority, but not the kind that earned respect. This was power wielded for control. The wiry one, Brian, leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening as his gaze flicked toward Michael. He nudged his partner, Chris, who glanced over with a grin. They exchanged a few words too quiet to hear. But Michael caught the tone, mocking, condescending. Michael's coffee arrived, the waitress sliding it across the counter. As he took a sip, Brian's voice rose just enough to carry across the room. "Looks like someone's lost their way," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Chris chuckled, leaning forward in his chair. You think he knows where he is? Michael didn't react. He had faced far worse than their juvenile taunts. Instead, he took another sip, letting the heat of the coffee ground him. The silence that followed was heavy, the air charged with unspoken challenges. As he placed the mug back on the counter, Michael caught the waitress's nervous glance. Her eyes flicked toward the two officers, then back to him. She opened her mouth as if to say something but thought better of it. Retreating behind the counter, Michael finished his coffee, leaving a few bills on the counter before standing to leave. He walked past Brian and Chris without so much as a glance, their laughter trailing behind him as he stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, the kind that made every breath feel sharper. Michael paused, looking down the length of Main Street. This town didn't know him yet, but they would. He wasn't here to fit in or be liked. He was here to bring change, real, meaningful change. And as he walked back to his car, he made a silent promise to himself. Whatever they throw at me, I'll stand tall. This town may not want change, but it's going to get it. The sun rose over Cedar Ridge the next morning, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Michael laced up his running shoes, ready for his morning ritual. Running was more than just exercise for him, it was a time to clear his mind and prepare for the day ahead. The crisp morning air greeted him as he stepped outside, the rhythmic crunch of his shoes on the dirt road echoing in the stillness. The path wound its way past the edges of town, cutting through a stretch of woods where the world felt quiet and introspective. As he jogged deeper into the wooded area, the faint hum of a vehicle broke the serenity. A patrol car crept along behind him, its engine low and deliberate. Michael didn't need to turn around to know who it was. He could feel the calculated presence of Brian and Chris, their intentions clear even before they revealed themselves. The car pulled up alongside him, matching his pace. Brian, leaning out of the passenger window, grinned smugly. "Morning, runner," he called out, his voice laced with mockery. "Looks like you've wandered onto the wrong path." Michael didn't respond. He continued his pace, his breathing steady, his focus unbroken. The patrol car edged closer, its tires kicking up small puffs of dirt. "You sure you're allowed to run here?" Chris chimed in from the driver's seat, his tone dripping with condescension. "This isn't exactly a tourist trail, pal." Michael stopped, his breaths even despite the effort of his run. Turning to face the two men, he kept his expression calm and composed. "Just out for a morning jog," he said evenly. "Didn't realize that was against the law." Chris shifted the car into park, the loud clunk breaking the silence. He stepped out, his large frame casting a shadow over the road. Brian followed, his smirk widening as he approached. "Not illegal," Chris said, folding his arms. "But around here, we've got our own rules, and I'm not sure you understand them." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Your own rules?" he asked, his voice calm but pointed. "Such as?" Brian stepped closer, the smirk never leaving his face. "We don't usually encourage strangers to wander around without a clear reason," he said, his eyes narrowing. Before Michael could respond, Brian reached out, patting down Michael's jacket pockets in an exaggerated display of authority. Michael didn't resist, standing still as Brian rifled through his belongings. From one pocket, Brian pulled out Michael's ID card and held it up dramatically, as if uncovering evidence. Well, Brian said mockingly. "What do we have here? This yours? Or did you pick it up along the way?" Chris chuckled. "Maybe it's his ticket back to wherever he came from." Michael's piercing gaze met Chris's. His calm tone belied the intensity of his words. "I'll be here for a long time," he said simply. The unexpected conviction in Michael's voice caused both men to falter momentarily. Brian's smirk flickered, and Chris furrowed his brow. But they quickly recovered, their arrogance shielding any trace of doubt. "Don't get too comfortable," Brian said, his tone hardening. We'll make sure you get used to the rules around here." Without another word, they grabbed Michael's arms and led him toward the patrol car. Michael didn't resist. He let them guide him, his composure unbroken. Inside, one thought repeated in his mind: let them dig their own graves. They have no idea who they're dealing with. As the patrol car rolled back toward Cedar Ridge, Michael sat quietly in the back seat, his hands cuffed in front of him. Through the rearview mirror, he could see Brian and Chris exchanging smug glances. They thought they were in control, but Michael knew better. They stopped in the middle of the town square, where early risers were already beginning their day. Chris yanked the door open and pulled Michael out, leading him toward the lamppost at the center of the square. The few people in the area froze, their conversations halting as they watched the scene unfold. Brian grabbed a length of rope from the trunk, his grin widening. "Let's give the town a little show," he said loudly. Michael stood tall as they tied him to the post, his expression unwavering. Around them, the crowd began to gather, whispers spreading as onlookers hesitated between curiosity and unease. Brian turned to the growing audience, spreading his arms theatrically. "All right, folks," he announced. "Today's lesson: don't wander where you don't belong." Chris chuckled, slapping Michael's shoulder. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge," he added with a sneer. Michael's icy gaze swept across the square. He could see the discomfort in some faces, the unease in others. And amidst it all, he saw phones being raised, cameras recording every second of the spectacle. "Let them watch," he thought. "This moment isn't mine to endure, it's theirs to regret." The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square as Brian and Chris finished tying Michael to the lamppost. The crowd around them grew larger, a mix of curiosity, unease, and quiet judgment spreading through the bystanders. Some whispered among themselves. Others hesitated with phones in hand, recording or live-streaming the spectacle. Michael stood tall, his posture unyielding, his gaze fixed ahead. He didn't look at Brian or Chris, nor did he glance at the faces in the crowd. He knew what they were trying to do: strip him of dignity, make him feel powerless. But Michael was no stranger to such attempts. Brian, emboldened by the crowd's silent presence, turned to the onlookers. "Take a good look," he shouted, his voice echoing across the square. "This is what happens when someone thinks they can wander into Cedar Ridge without knowing their place." Chris chuckled, his grin widening as he gestured toward Michael. "Let this be a reminder, folks. Some people don't belong here, and we're here to make sure they don't forget it." The crowd remained frozen, their reactions muted. A few people shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between Michael and the officers. Near the corner of the square, an older man named Mr. Carter watched in silence, his arms crossed. His disapproval was evident, though he made no move to intervene. Michael's silence spoke louder than any protest could. His calm, piercing gaze swept over the square, taking in every phone, every hesitant face, and every quiet murmur. He didn't need to speak because he knew the power of this moment wasn't in his hands, it was in theirs. "Got anything to say for yourself, buddy?" Brian taunted, leaning in close. Michael turned his head slightly, his voice low but steady. "I don't need to say anything. My actions will speak for me." Brian let out a derisive laugh, turning to Chris. "Hear that? He thinks he's got something to prove." But in that fleeting moment, a flicker of doubt crossed Brian's face. Something about Michael's unwavering composure unsettled him, though his bravado quickly returned. Meanwhile, the phones in the crowd captured everything: the mockery, the humiliation, and Michael's quiet defiance. As the minutes ticked by, these videos began to make their way onto social media. One bystander, a young woman named Clara, posted a short clip with the caption, "This is how Cedar Ridge treats outsiders. Unbelievable." It was shared within moments, the outrage spreading like wildfire. Comments flooded in: "Who are these officers? This is disgusting behavior. This man deserves justice. Back in the square, Brian and Chris exchanged satisfied grins as they stepped away from the lamppost. Leaving Michael bound, they walked to their patrol car, laughing as they climbed in, convinced they had made their point. Michael remained still, his head held high, his expression unreadable. To the crowd, it seemed as though he had been defeated. But Michael knew the truth: this wasn't an end, it was a beginning. The sun climbed higher, casting its harsh light on the scene as the patrol car pulled away. The square was still buzzing with tension, the whispers and murmurs growing louder. Some bystanders drifted away, their unease too heavy to bear. Others lingered, their phones still raised, recording every second. Michael's thoughts were sharp and focused. Let them think they've won, he told himself. They don't realize what they've just done. This moment belongs to me now, and it will be the catalyst for change. From a distance, Mr. Carter shook his head, his disapproval etched into the lines of his face. He turned and walked away, his slow, deliberate steps speaking volumes. Though he said nothing, his silence was not one of agreement but of quiet resolve. As the hours passed, the videos continued to circulate, reaching audiences far beyond Cedar Ridge. Outrage began to take root, voices demanding accountability growing louder with every share. Across the nation, people were beginning to see the injustice that had unfolded in this small southern town. And as Michael stood beneath the lamppost, tied but unbroken, he felt the winds of change begin to stir. This was only the start. As the hours passed, the videos of Michael tied to the lamppost began to take on a life of their own. What started as a few local posts quickly went viral, igniting a firestorm of outrage across social media. People from all walks of life shared the footage, their comments fueled by anger and disbelief. This is sickening. Who are these officers? This town needs to answer for this. In the small newsroom of a nearby city, journalist Lisa Brown came across the video. She watched intently, her brows furrowed as the scene played out on her screen. The mocking laughter of the officers, the silent crowd, and the quiet defiance in Michael's expression struck her deeply. She didn't just see a story, she saw a moment that could spark a movement. This needs to be covered, she said aloud, grabbing her camera bag and microphone. Within the hour, she was driving toward Cedar Ridge, determined to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, in the town square, Michael remained at the lamppost, still tied but standing tall. The crowd had thinned, but those who remained looked on in awkward silence. A few had tried to approach him, their faces reflecting discomfort and guilt. But his calm gaze had stopped them in their tracks. Brian and Chris were nowhere to be seen. Having left the scene to bask in their perceived victory, they sat in the police station's break room, recounting the incident with smug satisfaction. "Did you see his face?" Brian laughed. "I've never seen someone so desperate." Chris leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Serves him right. Maybe now he'll think twice about stepping where he doesn't belong." But as they reveled in their arrogance, they were blissfully unaware of the storm brewing outside. The videos of their actions were not just gaining attention, they were demanding accountability. Prominent figures began sharing the footage, calling for investigations and justice. The hashtag #JusticeForMichael trended nationwide, turning Cedar Ridge into the center of a heated national conversation. By the time Lisa arrived in town, the square was eerily quiet. Michael had been untied and escorted away by a few uneasy locals. But the tension in the air remained. Lisa set up her camera and began interviewing residents, trying to piece together the full story. Most people were reluctant to speak, their answers vague and guarded. But when she approached Mr. Carter, the elderly man hesitated for a long moment before sighing. "I saw what happened," he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "It wasn't right. It never is. But around here, people are scared. No one speaks up." Lisa pressed gently. "Do you think their actions were justified?" Mr. Carter shook his head firmly. No, he said, his voice trembling slightly. But I've lived here long enough to know how things work. People stay quiet because they think it's safer that way. Lisa nodded, her expression serious. She thanked Mr. Carter and moved on. But his words stayed with her. This wasn't just a story about two rogue officers, it was about a town complicit in its silence. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael sat in his small room, scrolling through the growing wave of posts and comments about the incident. He could see the momentum building, the outrage spreading far beyond Cedar Ridge. This is it, he thought. His expression calm but resolute. This is how change begins. He stood and moved to the corner of the room, where his crisp police chief uniform hung. The badge gleamed under the soft light, a symbol of authority and responsibility. Tomorrow, he would walk into the police station not as a victim, but as their leader. They wanted to make a spectacle out of me, Michael thought as he adjusted the uniform. Now they'll face the consequences of their own actions. And with that, he prepared for the confrontation that would not only change Cedar Ridge but serve as a lesson in justice and accountability for everyone watching. The morning light spilled over Cedar Ridge as Michael fastened the final button on his police chief uniform. The badge on his chest gleamed, catching the sunlight streaming through the window. It was more than just a symbol of authority, it was a reminder of why he had taken this job, to bring justice and fairness to a place that had long ignored both. With deliberate steps, Michael walked into the Cedar Ridge Police Department. Inside, the usual hum of morning activity greeted him, papers shuffled, coffee brewed, and low murmurs of conversation filled the air. But the moment Michael stepped through the doors, all activity ceased. Officers stopped in their tracks, heads turning toward the imposing figure in the doorway. Conversations died mid-sentence as recognition set in. This was the man they had seen tied to a lamppost in the town square, mocked and humiliated. Now, he stood before them, not as a victim but as their new leader. In the corner of the room, Brian and Chris sat laughing over cups of coffee, recounting their achievement to a younger officer. Brian leaned back in his chair, his smirk wide. "Did you see the way he just stood there?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Pathetic." Chris nodded, chuckling. "Bet he'll think twice before showing his face here again." Their laughter was cut short as the room fell silent. Brian turned, his smirk fading as his eyes locked on Michael. His face drained of color, his bravado replaced with sheer panic. Chris, slower to catch on, turned as well, his expression shifting from confusion to dread. Michael walked to the center of the room, his steps echoing loudly in the tense silence. He stood tall, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of every officer before finally settling on Brian and Chris. The weight of his presence was palpable. No one dared to move or speak. The two men who had laughed moments ago now sat frozen, their arrogance crumbling under Michael's unyielding stare. Brian stammered, his voice faltering. What are you doing here?" Michael didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, the tension thickening with every passing second. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but commanding. "I'm the man you should never have crossed." The room remained still, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Michael's words hung heavy in the air, each one a sharp reminder of the officer's mistake. Reaching into his pocket, Michael pulled out his phone. With a calm, deliberate motion, he played the viral video of the incident. Brian and Chris's mocking laughter filled the room, their actions replayed for everyone to see. The silence grew heavier as officers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort evident. Michael paused the video, his gaze never wavering. "This," he said, gesturing to the screen, "is what you allowed to happen. This is the behavior you thought was acceptable. Not just as individuals, but as representatives of this department." Brian attempted to protest, his voice shaking. "It was just a joke, a tradition. We didn't mean any harm." Michael's expression hardened. His tone sharp. A tradition? What kind of tradition humiliates another human being? What kind of tradition tarnishes the badge we wear? The younger officers, who had remained silent until now, began to shift uncomfortably. Some avoided Michael's gaze, while others nodded subtly in agreement with his words. Turning back to Brian and Chris, Michael's voice grew colder. Your actions didn't just humiliate me, they humiliated this department and this town. And I will not tolerate it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out 2 suspension notices, placing them on the desk in front of Brian and Chris. Effective immediately. You are both suspended pending further investigation. Hand over your badges and leave this station. Brian opened his mouth to argue, but a single look from Michael silenced him. Reluctantly, the 2 men removed their badges, placing them on the desk. Their humiliation was now complete. Their arrogance shattered. As they walked out of the station under the watchful eyes of their colleagues, Michael stood tall, knowing this was only the first step in transforming Cedar Ridge. Justice had begun to take root, and Michael was ready to see it through. The silence in the Cedar Ridge Police Department lingered long after Brian and Chris had left. Their badges sat on the desk, glinting under the fluorescent lights, stark symbols of their disgrace. The remaining officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what would come next. Michael stood in the center of the room, his posture unwavering, his gaze sweeping over the group. This department is meant to stand for justice and integrity, he began, his voice steady but resolute. But what I saw in that square yesterday, the actions of 2 men trusted to serve and protect, was the opposite of those values. And everyone here shares the responsibility of allowing it to happen. His words struck a nerve. Officers who had remained silent during Brian and Chris's reign of intimidation now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young officer, clearly nervous, raised his hand hesitantly. Chief Adams, he said, his voice shaking. Some of us didn't agree with what they did. But speaking up, he paused, struggling for the right words. Michael nodded, his expression softening slightly. I understand the fear of speaking out, he said. I know what it's like to feel powerless against those who abuse their authority. But fear is what lets people like them thrive. If we want to rebuild trust, that fear must end here. The young officer nodded, his shoulders straightening slightly as if emboldened by Michael's words. Others in the room seemed to draw strength from the moment, their unease giving way to a quiet determination. Michael continued, Today marks the start of a new chapter for this department. We will not just enforce the law, we will uphold dignity, fairness, and accountability. That means we don't turn a blind eye to injustice, whether it's on the streets or within these walls. His gaze hardened as he addressed the entire room. If anyone here feels they cannot meet that standard, now is the time to walk away. No shame, no judgment. But I will not tolerate complicity. No one moved. The weight of his words settled heavily over the room. But there was also a sense of resolve. For the first time in years, Cedar Ridge's officers were being called to account, and they were starting to believe it was possible to do better. Later that day, the news of Brian and Chris's suspension spread quickly through the town. At the Fairview Diner, conversations buzzed with speculation and cautious optimism. Emily, the young waitress who had served Michael earlier, watched the discussions unfold with a mix of relief and hope. I heard he walked into the station like he owned the place, one patron said, sipping his coffee. He's not here to play games, another chimed in. This might be the wake-up call Cedar Ridge needed. Emily smiled faintly, her mind drifting to the quiet determination she had seen in Michael's eyes that day. For the first time in years, it felt like change wasn't just a distant dream, it was happening right here in Cedar Ridge. Meanwhile, in his small office, Michael reviewed files and notes late into the evening. Complaints against Brian and Chris, long buried under layers of bureaucracy, were beginning to surface. Residents emboldened by the viral videos and Michael's decisive actions had started coming forward to share their stories. One particularly heartbreaking account came from Sarah, a young woman who had been stopped by Brian 2 years earlier. She described how he had berated her during a routine traffic stop, using his badge as a tool for intimidation. "I stayed quiet because I was scared," she admitted, her voice trembling as she recounted the incident. "But now, seeing what happened to you, I know I can't stay silent anymore." Michael listened carefully, his hands folded on the desk as Sarah spoke. Her story, like so many others, fueled his resolve. "Thank you for coming forward," he said gently. "Your courage will make a difference. Not just for you but for this entire town." As the night stretched on, Michael sat alone in his office, the weight of his role settling over him. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. Change never came without resistance. But as he looked at the growing stack of statements and complaints, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Cedar Ridge was beginning to find its voice, and Michael was determined to amplify it. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The next morning, Cedar Ridge woke to a palpable sense of change. News of Brian and Chris's suspension had reached nearly every corner of town, and their absence from the police force sent a clear message: accountability was no longer optional. Michael, wearing his crisp police chief uniform, stood at the center of the town square where the spectacle had unfolded just days earlier. This time, he wasn't alone. Dozens of residents had gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity, hope, and cautious skepticism. Among them were Emily, the young waitress, and Mr. Carter, the elderly man who had quietly watched the events unfold from a distance. Michael raised a hand to quiet the murmurs. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the weight of his authority and sincerity. "I know this town has seen its share of challenges, and I know trust has been broken between the police department and the community, and among neighbors." He paused, scanning the crowd. "But I'm here to tell you this: the Cedar Ridge you've known, the one that allowed injustice to thrive, ends today." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Michael continued, his voice steady and deliberate. "The actions of Brian Taylor and Chris Walker do not represent what this department stands for or what it will stand for moving forward. They were wrong, and they will face the consequences of their actions. But accountability doesn't stop with them. It starts here, with all of us." Emily, standing near the front, felt a lump form in her throat. For years, she had watched Cedar Ridge operate under an unspoken code of silence, where standing up for what was right often felt impossible. Now, hearing Michael speak, she felt something stir within her, a glimmer of hope that things could truly be different. Michael gestured toward a small stage that had been set up in the square. On it sat a microphone and a few chairs. "I want to hear from you," he said. "Your concerns, your ideas, your stories. This is your community, and if we're going to rebuild it, we need to do it together." One by one, residents began stepping forward. A middle-aged man spoke about an incident years earlier when he'd been unfairly ticketed and intimidated by Chris. A young mother described her fear of letting her children play outside because of the toxic environment created by the officers' unchecked behavior. Then, Sarah, the young woman who had shared her story with Michael privately, approached the microphone. Her hands trembled as she gripped it, but her voice was clear. "I was afraid to speak up for a long time," she began, her eyes scanning the crowd. "But seeing what happened to Chief Adams made me realize that staying silent only lets people like Brian and Chris win. I don't want my kids to grow up in a town where they have to fear the people who are supposed to protect them." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present. A few people wiped their eyes, while others nodded in solemn agreement. Michael stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Thank you," he said. "Your courage is exactly what this town needs." The forum continued into the afternoon, with more residents coming forward to share their experiences and ideas for change. As the crowd began to disperse, There was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Cedar Ridge, for the first time in years, felt united not in its silence, but in its determination to rebuild. Later that evening, Michael returned to his office, exhausted but resolute. On his desk was a growing stack of files, each one a story of injustice that had long been buried. He opened one and began reading, his mind already turning over plans for reforms and community outreach. The road ahead was daunting, but Michael knew the fight was worth it. Cedar Ridge was waking up, finding its voice. And as long as he was there, he would ensure that voice was heard. As the days turned into weeks, Cedar Ridge began its transformation. The police department, once a symbol of intimidation for many, became the epicenter of change. Under Michael's leadership, the officers underwent rigorous training sessions focused on ethics, de-escalation, and building trust with the community. These were not mere formalities, they were the foundation of a new culture, one based on respect and accountability. Michael's open forums in the town square became a weekly event. Each time, more residents gathered, not just to share grievances but to offer solutions. Emily often stood at the front, her voice gaining strength as she encouraged others to speak. Mr. Carter, once a quiet observer, now actively participated, sharing his wisdom and urging the younger generation to embrace the opportunity for change. One particular morning, as Michael stood addressing the crowd, he noticed a shift in the energy. The skepticism that had once lingered in the air was being replaced by cautious optimism. People who had once avoided the square now gathered with purpose. Conversations were no longer whispers of fear but discussions about progress. "I never thought I'd see the day," Mr. Carter said, standing beside Emily. "But here it is, a town finding its way back to decency." Emily smiled, nodding. "It's because of Chief Adams. He didn't just stand up for himself, he stood up for all of us." Behind the scenes, the ripple effects of Michael's actions were still unfolding. The viral video of the incident continued to draw national attention, prompting external investigations into the Cedar Ridge Police Department. This scrutiny unearthed years of misconduct by Brian and Chris, as well as systemic issues that had allowed their behavior to persist unchecked. Journalist Lisa Brown remained a steady presence in the town, covering every step of the transformation. Her reports highlighted the courage of residents like Sarah, who had spoken out despite years of silence. The narrative wasn't just about exposing injustice, it was about the power of community to demand and enact change. In one particularly moving segment, Lisa interviewed Michael in his office. The backdrop was unassuming, but his words carried profound weight. "This isn't just about two officers," he said. "It's about rebuilding trust. It's about ensuring that every person in Cedar Ridge feels seen, heard, and respected. That's the real work, and it's far from over." The efforts bore fruit. Policies were rewritten. New officers were hired with an emphasis on empathy and integrity, and the department instituted regular community engagement programs. Officers patrolled neighborhoods on foot, not just to enforce the law but to connect with residents. Over time, the sight of a police uniform no longer elicited fear but instead began to inspire trust. One late afternoon, as Michael walked through the town square, he saw children playing near the fountain, laughing, carefree. Nearby, officers were chatting with residents, their interactions warm and genuine. Sarah was planting flowers around the square, her children helping beside her. Michael paused, taking in the scene. It was a far cry from the tense, divided town he had encountered upon his arrival. Cedar Ridge was not perfect, progress never came without setbacks, but it was on a path toward healing. As he stood there, Mr. Carter approached, his steps deliberate. "Chief Adams," he said, his voice steady, "this town owes you more than it can ever repay. You gave us hope when we didn't think it was possible." Michael smiled faintly, shaking his head. "The credit doesn't belong to me alone," he replied. "It belongs to everyone who stood up, who found their voice. and who chose to believe in something better. This town did the hard work, I just reminded them what they were capable of. Mr. Carter nodded, a glint of pride in his eyes. Well, you've done something extraordinary here. Don't forget that. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the square in warm hues of gold and orange, Michael took a deep breath. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, Cedar Ridge felt like a community united by purpose, not divided by fear. And as Michael walked back to the station, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight, he knew this was just the beginning. The seeds of change had been planted, and their roots were growing stronger with each passing day. Cedar Ridge was becoming a symbol not of its past, but of its potential. As the sun sets over Cedar Ridge, the town stands as a testament to the power of resilience, unity, and accountability. From a moment of humiliation to a movement for justice, one man's courage inspired an entire community to embrace change and rebuild trust. This is more than a story about a town, it's a reminder that transformation is always possible when people choose to stand together. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories to explore more tales of hope and perseverance. See you in the next story.